And there are data that show that if you're in a business meeting, for example, the mere fact of having a phone visible on the table is sufficient to degrade the quality of presence that exists in
Yeah,
the
even if you don't
conversation.
pick it up, this is amazing. That's an
Yeah,
amazing
even if you
finding.
don't pick it up, and even if the notifications are off. And so make an intentional choice of virtually never, unless I'm expecting a critical phone call. But other than a very rare circumstance, I do not take my phone out of my pocket and place it on the table in a meeting. And so this is really part of a new kind of education that I think we all need to do for digital hygiene. And as I've said in a previous episode of Dharma Lab, we are all participants in a grand experiment for which none of us have provided our informed consent. And so I think we need to be active in finding solutions to remove this big source of distraction and suffering that most of us now have in our lives.
Richie, in a previous discussion, we talked about overthinking, rumination, how common it is, why it happens, a little bit about the biology of what's going on. In this session, I thought we could talk about the different strategies for how to deal with the restless, oftentimes toxic energy of our own minds. And you've been meditating for 50 years. I've been meditating for many decades myself. We've worked with many different strategies. And of course, as scientists, you've done research on this for, many, many decades as well. So there's a lot to say on this. I wanted to start off with a very practical piece, which is I'm kind of curious how overthinking and rumination have manifested in your life and what personally you've done with that. Maybe we could start with a little bit about our personal experience, and then we can zoom out and talk about three specific strategies that can be very helpful, very different strategies for dealing with the thinking mind. But what's your personal experience? Actually, I've never asked you this. Have you struggled with this? What's it like in your mind?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a very normal, ordinary human being, and struggle with this. At times in my life, it's been more prevalent than at other times. But one of the things that you've often talked about early days in your meditation practice, where your mind is filled with thoughts. Sometimes you're completely lost the whole time. And, I think that when we sit in meditation, it's a very clear period where we can really directly see into our own mind. We're dropping the noise from the outside world to a large extent. And it opens us up to the noise of our interior world. So
And
the
it can
signal
be
to noise
very noisy,
ratio,
as we know.
yeah, the signal to noise ratio for our mind becomes much, much higher. Not because we're boosting the signal from our mind so much as we're reducing the signal from the outside world. And so you can really see how chaotic your mind is. And so, particularly at certain stages in my career, when I was worrying about grants that are going to happen in the future or may happen, may not happen. How am I going to support this person or that person? Um, those thoughts often came up for me during meditation. They were disturbing, and I dealt with them in different ways. Really, I think the most helpful way that I dealt with them is when I started appreciating how actually all these thoughts were actually they derived fundamentally from my wish to be helpful to people, um, and to really serve and to I mean, in many cases, it was really about how we're going to support the people that I have come to consider both colleagues, but also really close friends. Um, and so recognizing that my worry actually came from a place of goodness um, was just helpful in taking the edge off that. Um, so that's one thing that I did. There are other strategies that I use too. And one of the strategies I sometimes have used while meditating is to keep a notepad by my meditation cushion. And if I'm really bothered by a thought, I would write it down, just one or two words, and then just let it go. And I found it much easier to let it go because I knew I wrote a note to myself that would remind me of it. And if it was really so important, I can come back to it later. And this way I can actually um, be more present and have that thought just written down for future use. And that has sometimes been helpful as well. So those are two strategies that I've used.
Yeah, that's really helpful to hear. Actually, fascinating to hear. I just realized we actually never have talked about that specifically, so I appreciate you sharing that. And I've developed my own go-to strategies over the years as well. I mean, you've heard me talk many times, and those of you who've listened to Dharma Lab, especially our last session, you heard a little bit about my early days as a meditator, where the ruminating mind was a very dominant part of my meditation practice. I would say a few things that have helped me over the years. The first thing I would say was learning to widen the scope of my awareness, so I wasn't so contracted into my thoughts. I think I very quickly learned that battling my mind and trying to turn the thinking mind off was a losing battle, and also just not a helpful thing to have a very adversarial stance towards my own mind. But widening the scope so I could, for example, be aware of my body was really, really helpful. Being aware of my breath, not as a way to empty my mind or stop my mind from thinking, but just getting out of the inner contraction that happens. That was really helpful. The practice I think I've probably done the most. In fact, I was just sitting down in this very peaceful setting. Right now I'm up in the boundary waters of northern Minnesota, um, which is one of my favorite spots on the planet. And I was sitting right next to the lake. If you would have looked at me, you would have thought, oh, this peaceful surrounding, and this guy's got a peaceful look on his face. His mind must just be so calm and serene. Actually, there was a lot of thoughts moving through my mind in this particular morning meditation. But I did what I do many times, and I've done for years, which is rather than trying to stop my thoughts or redirect to something else, I actually just observed the thoughts themselves. I thought, okay, my mind's a little busy today. And I actually made that the object of my meditation. So we'll talk about this. This is one of the key strategies, actually, is you, rather than fighting it, you use the energy of your experience. In this case, the energy of the restless mind and perpetuating thoughts, rumination even, and you just observe it. You just hold space for it, like you're holding space for a you know, a kid who's having a temper tantrum or something like that. So maybe we could dive in and talk about these three strategies. You and I have had many discussions about these. In fact, we're working on a book on this same topic with Mingyur Rinpoche. And maybe just to name them briefly, and we can start going through a little of the scientific understanding and the meditative perspective on these three. But in short, there's three very different ways of working with the restless energy of the mind. The first is what we might call removing the restless thoughts. Basically, the end point is that you have actually gotten rid of the thinking mind in this case. The second is to transform. The key word is to transform, but really it's to transform one's relationship to it. And the third is to transcend, in which you don't necessarily do away with it or even change your relationship to it, but rather you're seeing something that is beyond that. You're seeing the space, the inner space within which all of this is happening. So there are three very different strategies. And maybe we could start with the remove piece. And the removal strategy is interesting because there's kind of a plan A and plan B to it. Plan A is all about the triggers, the cues, you might say, in which case you can develop a sensitivity to the things that will provoke a reaction in your mind. The second option, plan B, is once it's already happened, what do you do with it then? And there's things you can do that essentially will shift the trajectory of the experience such that that rumination maybe isn't happening anymore. But let's start with the first of these, because I think there's this is a pretty common strategy, I would say, even in modern psychology beyond the meditative tradition. So what any thoughts coming to mind on this first removal strategy?
Yeah. So, and we often say remove and replace. So we can remove what may be causing the difficulty and replace it with something more neutral. Um, and so, if we are having some disturbing thoughts when we're meditating, we might switch to, for example, doing a simple loving kindness or compassion meditation where we bring into mind a person that we loved, and we wish them to be happy and to be free of suffering. So we just completely remove and replace, if you will, the the negative thoughts with something that is neutral or more positive.
And that's
Uh,
actually an interesting point, because in that example, and it's a really important point, you haven't necessarily removed thoughts in some cases. You could actually replace them with positive thoughts. So you still have thoughts. You might still have the thinking mind is doing its thing. In some cases, the thinking might dissipate or diminish. In some cases, you might just replace it with a positive line of thoughts like appreciation or gratitude, but your mind is still thinking.
Yeah, and so that's one kind of strategy. Another strategy is one actually that you mentioned, Court, where you can simply become aware of your body. I mean, one of the amazing things is that our minds are embodied, and as Mingyur Rinpoche often says, we can use the body as support for awareness. And so we can bring our awareness to the body. We can notice our breath. We can notice sensations elsewhere in our body. And that often helps to ground us, to help us switch from a mode of doing to one of simply being, to a more embodied sense of self rather than the narrative self. The narrative self is when we get all wrapped up in this experience of um, our thoughts and expectations and beliefs about who we think we are. And when we drop in, so to speak, to our bodies, we're having a direct experience of our bodies. And this can often help to relax us, to replace our, at least our focus of awareness from our thoughts to our body, this more neutral set of sensations. And that's something that is highly accessible. We really could do that anytime, anywhere. And that often does the trick for a lot of people, and is so accessible that it's often a first line of defense, if you will, in this kind of situation.
Yeah, I use that in so much, especially, I mean, I still use it to this day, actually, a lot, but
Yeah, me
especially
too.
in the early days, it was so helpful. For me, I worked a lot with my breath. And when we get into the second method of transform, there's also a way of using the emotional response or using the thinking mind and changing your relationship to that, which is quite similar but has some distinctions. And also, when I think about what I personally do with this first category, there's a ton of territory to explore and self-discovery to be had when it comes to the the aspect of removing the triggers or the cues. For example, I've noticed in my own life the role that technology has, and these little things that we normally don't think of are constantly provoking responses in our minds and even in our bodies and our biology. So, for example, I've learned first to see that the things like notifications and how many notifications do we get a day if you have them turned on and your phone's vibrating or dinging, pinging you throughout the day, you're getting countless messages, emails, texts, all sorts of different messages coming in. And at a certain point, I realized that this was just continuously provoking a response where every time that happened, there was this ripple effect in my experience where it would happen. Maybe it's as simple as a text coming in. And in many cases, perhaps I would be in a meeting or with other people and it wasn't appropriate. But then I would have this little ripple effect where my mind would think, oh, who might it be? And should I look and should I get it? And it just triggers this little cascade of activity. So for me to go back to this method, one of the things we can do is just to notice what those cues are. And if they're not provoking a healthy adaptive response, change the cue. We can't always do this, but I have, as a baseline, I have my phone muted all of the time. I literally almost never turn it on so that I can look at it when I actually need it. Or as we've talked about in other contexts, I don't bring my phone into my bedroom with me. I don't have it next to me when I sleep. So I'll literally just leave it on a charger in a different room so it's not next to me. I'm like literally removing the very thing that would be provoking continuous responses.
Yeah, and just to say something more about that, I also have my phone in a permanent state of notifications off. And there are data that show that if you're in a business meeting, for example, the mere fact of having a phone visible on the table is sufficient to degrade the quality of presence that exists in
Yeah,
the
even if you don't
conversation.
pick it up, this is amazing. That's an
Yeah,
amazing
even if you
finding.
don't pick it up, and even if the notifications are off. And so make an intentional choice of virtually never, unless I'm expecting a critical phone call. But other than a very rare circumstance, I do not take my phone out of my pocket and place it on the table in a meeting. And I try not to be the digital police in the center that I direct, but I do notice when people keep their phone on the table, and I occasionally say something if I know they don't really need it out. It's just a distraction to keep it there, and so this is really part of a new kind of education that I think we all need to do for digital hygiene. And as I've said in a previous episode of Dharma Lab, we are all participants in a grand experiment for which none of us have provided our informed consent. And so I think we need to be active in finding solutions to remove this big source of distraction and suffering that most of us now have in our lives.
There's so many examples you can give about ways in which we mindlessly use technology that, again, provoke rumination, they provoke thoughts, they provoke emotional responses, all sorts of different things. And usually we just don't even think about it, but they're happening so many times. Like I can't remember the exact data point. You might remember, Richie, but the average person picks up their phone and turns it on something like 150 or more
Yeah,
times a day
yeah,
along those lines.
yes, yeah, about 152 times a day.
So, how many times do you think consciously and intentionally about what you want that experience to be like? We had a colleague from another organization who we worked with who said that she noticing that actually created her like the screen on the home screen where usually you have all your apps actually had one screen that has nothing on it. So when she turns on her phone, she just sees the picture first, like of her family or whatever. And then she can consciously choose to where she wants to go and to pick an app. But that first moment of picking up the app is not notifications or mindlessly opening up a bunch of different apps, but actually a moment of connection, in this case with her family. And I actually, I did that. I don't know if you did it as well, Richie, but I was like, oh, that's a great idea. And it's just like these little things that normally we're doing mindlessly. you can do with intention and actually construct the inner experience that you're interested in. But in any case, it goes back to this idea of remove and replace. So in some cases, we can consciously remove the cues and the triggers that get us to have these reactions. And in some cases might actually lead to rumination or just getting stuck in loops of thoughts or some strong emotional response. In some cases, we can't control that. There's nothing you can do. Thoughts are still going to happen. And so then there's the question of, well, what do you do next? So as you said, Richie, sometimes bringing awareness into your body is an example of that. You could think something more pleasant and consciously shift from a more toxic, negatively oriented thoughts to something positive. There's all sorts of different ways that you can essentially remove and replace the negative experience with something more positive. That's the first example. The second method that is also really powerful, but in a very different way, is to transform one's relationship to the thinking mind. The important thing here is that the end point of this is not that the thinking changes or goes away. So if your mind is you're thinking you're have a bad memory and you're just kind of playing that out in your mind, or you're thinking about something that might happen in the future and you're getting upset or anxious about it. In this strategy, you're actually not trying to change the content of the thought, but you can shift the way you're relating to it such that it doesn't have the same toxic impact. So for me, I
Less
mentioned that
sticky, we
yeah, it's
say.
less yeah, exactly. It's less sticky. So just to give one example, and again, Richie, would love to hear your examples. And I'd love to probe you a little bit and see if you would imagine what might be happening in the brain when we do this. But I just mentioned how I was meditating a few minutes ago and I had a lot of thoughts. My mind was a little restless. And rather than trying to change my thoughts or to redirect my attention to something else, I actually use the thoughts themselves as the support for my meditation. I just kind of, like I was holding space, let all the thoughts come up, but in the field of awareness, rather than pulling me into distraction, the thoughts were a support for being present, as strange as that might sound. And I wasn't trying to change them or do anything with them. So there's a number of different ways we can do this transform strategy, but let me turn it over to you. I'm curious, anything
Yeah.
you want to share?
Yeah. So, this is, very powerful strategy. And to some people who are new to meditation, it may seem a little bit odd that we can actually use our thoughts in this way and not have to push them away, but really fully honor them, um, but shift our relationship to them. And so when we are ruminating, when a thought gets us upset and sort of takes us down a garden path that spirals, where we have the experience of our minds getting lost,
In
that
my
is an
case, it's more of
example.
a swamp, not a garden, but yeah, but
It is, and we talk about the thoughts being sticky. Then they just grab you, and it's like, being in the middle of a river. This is a metaphor that we often use, that is just rushing downstream, and you're in the river, and you're just being pulled by it. Well, there's a network in the brain that is important um, in noticing stuff that's important, noticing what we call salient things. And if we have thoughts that we think are important, it will hijack the salience network. This is a network that includes many of the emotional centers of the brain. And we then the thought takes on outsized importance, if you will. We think that this is really critical. Um, what happens when we are in this mode of transforming, where we can transform our relationship to the thoughts? We can see the thoughts as thoughts. We're not trying to get rid of them. We're not trying to push them away, but simply being able to observe them in this kind of different mode, where we're shifting our relationship to them, changes the extent to which those thoughts will activate the salience network. And literally, the echoes of this that we see in the brain are changes in the connectivity between different networks. And so the rumination and the self referential thoughts, thoughts about ourselves, is associated with activation of what we're calling the default mode. And the default mode will often be highly connected to the salience network, which will pull the salience network into this so that we think these thoughts are really important. And what happens is when we begin to change our relationship to the thoughts aren't going away. The salience network is still alive and well, but it's not dragging the salience network into this. Um, uh, it's a change in the connectivity between the default mode and the salience network. And this is something that's now been observed many times in studies of meditation. And it really, one of the other metaphors that we use is the sky and the clouds. You can think of thoughts, particularly negative thoughts, maybe being like storm clouds. And they will come and they'll go, but the sky doesn't change. The sky is like our awareness, it's there all the time. But what does change is the presence of these clouds. And so, if we can see these thoughts as clouds in the sky that come and go, we really can change our relationship to the thoughts and change our brains in the process.
That's so helpful. And there's so many interesting avenues to explore in this transformed category. Another one that I've personally found really helpful is that the painful experiences we have, in fact, the more painful they are, the more helpful they are when it comes to being empathetic and understanding the challenges and suffering that other people experience. So the fact that I experienced so much anxiety early in my life, as an example, every time I talk about that, and I talk about it frequently, especially if I'm in a more public forum, people always come up to me at the end and just say, "Oh, thank you. It was so helpful to know that you struggled with these things and you found ways to deal with that." And so even as they're happening in real time, you can think they can actually be that window and that trigger for empathy rather than for spinning off in the more negative side. So, for example, if you have some kind of intrusive thoughts or things that are really painful, without changing the thoughts themselves, you can just recognize that there are so many other people who are struggling with similar things and just wish the best for them. Wish that, okay, I'm having these difficult thoughts right now. May other people who are experiencing that, may they be free from this. May they struggle less and suffer less. So there's a way where this can be a bridge into compassion, into connecting with other people. In the framework we've developed, of course, like this would be the space of connection. It can also be a gateway into great insight. So, for example, another one that I found really helpful is simply to ask myself, how is this mental, emotional experience that's playing out right now? How is it shaping the way I see myself or see the world? And what I've noticed is that if the mind has more negative thoughts, if they're anxious or angry or frustrated or upset, it tends to be like a magnet for negative information. And by asking that question, I start to see that my line of thinking is screening out a whole area of information, which is the more positive stuff. And it's like a magnet. It's kind of just latching onto and getting stuck on the negative. Similarly, if the mind is stuck in desire, it's the opposite of that. In fact, I have this experience I've had many, many times over where it seems to happen most frequently when I go to a mall. And I can't say I find myself in shopping malls very often, but occasionally I do. And you're surrounded by stuff and stores. And of course, it's all about buying things. And I'll think, oh, maybe I should, get a new pair of shoes or whatever. And the mind just, if it goes into that desire space, if I step back and I notice that line of thinking, and then I just ask, what am I not seeing clearly here? It's kind of the opposite of that. My mind is only thinking of the positive. it's screening out the negative. But in either case, it's like it's like a mental distortion is playing out, and it's all due to the contraction into the thought. But when I can zoom out, I don't need to change the thought. The thought itself becomes the basis for insight and self-exploration. So in any case, it's kind of like to use your example, it gives you the space to just examine the clouds and the weather patterns and just to see how it's all playing out. So we can move on to the transcend. But any thoughts on this from your perspective before
No,
we
I
move on?
think that the notion that there is an aperture to our awareness that can contract or expand is really important. Many of us don't think about it in that way, but we have the capacity to widen that aperture, um, and that can be enormously helpful in in allowing us to see that the thought that we're having is maybe not quite as significant as we thought it might be when our aperture is much more narrow. So, super important.
And that's a great segue to the final strategy. So we have remove and replace. We have transform, where you're not getting rid of it, but you're changing your relationship to it. It becomes a basis for awareness or connection or insight or purpose. In this last one of transcend, it's like we're gaining deep insight into the very nature of the experience. And in a way, it's even more radical than the transform, certainly more radical than the first one where we're trying to change it. It's actually the analogy you gave of the sky and the clouds is perfect here, because one way that we can do that is that we pay a little less attention to all the weather patterns and the dynamics of those weather patterns, and we're actually exploring the sky itself. And this sounds, I'm sure, hopelessly abstract and esoteric to somebody if you haven't done these practices, but it starts with returning to awareness, you could say, of just seeing awareness is present throughout all these experiences. And then you actually, as you get grounded, more and more grounded in awareness, you can actually start exploring awareness itself in the same way that you might be more aware of your breath, explore the breath or your experience of your body. You actually can do that with awareness itself, as strange as that may seem. I'm guessing that there's not a lot of research. It's interesting because this is held up as really the pinnacle of the different approaches we could take in the Tibetan tradition specifically, and in other traditions. But there's probably comparatively little research. But what do we know about this particular style or method of dealing with the
Yeah, I mean,
rumination?
it's I would say where the best research is that bears on this is in pain.
Hmm.
And so uh, to make this accessible, it's helpful to think about how we often refer to pain in everyday life. And so it would not be uncommon for any of you, for me, for anyone to say, for example, if they, let's say they stub their toe um, on a piece of furniture, and then to say, wow, I'm in pain. And so the transcend strategy, or it could be in this case, to take that moment and use it as a moment of curiosity where you investigate, well, who is this I that is saying I am in pain? Is it really all of me that's in pain? And use this as an opportunity. In psychology, we would say an affordance, which is something that happens, an event that can be an opportunity, a context that provokes this kind of curiosity-driven exploration. And the research shows that in very long-term meditation practitioners who've done this kind of practice a lot, when they have when they experience pain in the laboratory, and the pain that we use, the painful stimulus that we use is heat, which is a very ecologically valid kind of um, stimulus. It's all of us have had the experience of touching, a hot surface and really feeling what that's like. It's very real, and we all have a kind of subjective understanding of it. And when these long-term practitioners are given this experience, we see very different changes that are occurring in their brain, and they're associated with what we might think of as the neural signature of resilience, where they show a lot of response to the painful stimulus itself. It's not like there's emotional zombies that are not experiencing anything, but there's a difference between experiencing the heat stimulus and being distressed by it. The identification with the pain is really the primary driver of suffering in this case. And in a previous episode of Dharma Lab, we talked about the two arrows in the Buddhist context. The first arrow in this case would be the heat itself, which is the painful stimulus. The second arrow is all of the worry and anxiety and distress in response to that first arrow. And it turns out that that second arrow is really the primary contributor to our subjective experience of distress. And so the capacity to transcend in this case is really about the recognition that the I is really different than what it's cracked up to be, if you will, and a lot more porous.
Yeah, so much to say. In fact, we should have a whole episode, maybe a whole series of episodes specifically on this topic. But it brings back so many memories and things that I found really helpful in my own life, where it starts with simply a wider space of awareness, where you're less contracted into the experience, or to use your example, carried away by the current, like you're lost in the river and you're just being swept away, where almost you can find your way to the shore and you can be observing the experience. And there's practices where you do that, where you just watch it, and there's really nothing more than that. Like you're watching your breath, you can watch your thoughts, you can watch your emotional responses. But then as you're indicating, there's the getting curious and examining what even are these experiences. So for me, I actually did this a lot with my kind of the anxious response, and it was so fascinating when I asked a question, what even is anxiety? I had thought of myself as an anxious person. And when I stepped back and said, well, what even is this? Like, I should be pretty clear on what it actually means. And what I saw is that there are thoughts in the mind, and they're moving and changing all the time. There's this very dynamic response in the body. And I could notice patterns, but that too was changing, and it wasn't the same all the time. And then there was almost like this emotional atmosphere where there was a feeling of an expectation of something negative, I guess is a way to put it, but like a feeling, not like the thinking mind, but almost like this sense that something bad is going to happen, and that could be in the future, it could be right around the corner. And I started seeing that all of these things are shifting and moving. And when I looked into any one of them, even like a physical response, the more I would look into it, the less solid it felt, the more fluid it felt, the more open it felt. Mingyur Rinpoche often gives this example of shaving foam, which is such a perfect example. Like if you look at it, it looks like it's this big solid thing, but if you touch it, it's almost nothing. It's almost like, yeah, almost like open space. And that's how it feels when you investigate these experiences. And I have since done that with so many things. I've given examples of feeling bored and restless, which was another thing I felt early in my meditation life. And you just look at these experiences, and it's like, where and what even are these things? And when you look, it's so much more fluid, so much more dynamic. And then it becomes kind of interesting and fascinating. It's like it just sort of dissolves before your very eyes, and you're just kind of left with this much more open, fluid experience. Whereas before, it felt very solid and heavy. So the final thing I wanted to ask is maybe the the most esoteric aspect of this. And it's this idea that there is some part of us that is really beyond all of these fleeting experiences that we have. And normally we're totally out of touch with this. So there are these traditions in Buddhism and in other spiritual and meditative traditions that I think these days we would think of as non-dual traditions. It's the idea that our true nature is just something that's utterly beyond these experiences. And it's not a belief system. It's something we actually can learn to train ourselves for. So you're one of the few people on the planet that has studied people who are expert meditators in these non-dual, pure awareness traditions. So it's something it's very hard to study, and there hasn't been a ton of research. But is there anything maybe just to inspire us with the full range of human experience? Because we've been lucky to know these people, and you've studied them. Yeah, what have you learned, and what do you think it holds for our potential as human beings?
Yeah, well, there's both a lot to say and very little to say simultaneously about this, since there really has not been very much scientific research specifically on these non-dual experiences. Um, uh, the way you introduced it, I think, is very important, and that is that in these traditions, there is a recognition that there is um, a part of us that is untainted, if you will, by these momentary experiences. A part that is you might think of it as pure and pristine, like the sky, the beautiful blue sky. And we know that clouds can arise, tornadoes can happen, and yet they'll pass. And when they pass, it's the same pristine blue sky. Hasn't changed, hasn't been altered by these clouds. And in these traditions, it's said that our nature is that, and our nature is imbued with this quality of awareness, and also a quality of it's sometimes referred to in these traditions as innate goodness or innate compassion, and that this is really our nature, and that what we do when we meditate is not so much create some new form of awareness or build up compassion, but rather we're sort of peeling the gunk away and recognizing our true nature. And
And that's why
um,
the shift from doing to being is so important, because normally we try to do our way to that, but we can't because it's something that's already here. So you can only learn to see it. You can't create it or improve it.
Yeah, and so this capacity also is one that, um, uh, particularly when it's combined with compassion, leads to the recognition that all human beings are basically the same. We're all endowed with these capacities, and we all are interdependent. We all are part of this web together. And for me, the most striking thing is that the recognition of this leads to real behavioral change, and it leads to people being infectiously kind, and really just warm-hearted, and they're the kind of people we want to be around. And so, one of the important take-home lessons from the work with long-term practitioners is that we were blessed to have this extraordinary group of people who nurtured our own hearts by simply being around them, because it was infectious. They radiated with these qualities. And I'll end with just this one little story. We had this long-term practitioner who was being tested in our lab, And for many of these practitioners, we had them stay in a hotel that was just on the border of the west side of the campus, right near the brain imaging lab where we were testing them. And the day after this practitioner left, I was called by the manager of this hotel, and I thought that we screwed up with the billing, because it's supposed to be billed directly to the university, and that's why the manager was calling me. And it turned out that that's not what he was calling me about. He was calling me to simply thank me for having such really amazing people stay at his hotel. And he said this last guy who we had stay in the hotel, who was a monk, was so kind to all the people, to the um, person behind the desk when he checked in, to the people who were cleaning his room, and to the person who is the manager of the restaurant in the hotel where he was getting his breakfast. And he simply wanted to thank me for having these people stay in his hotel. That is an unobtrusive mark of the fruition of this kind of practice.
That's such a beautiful story. I mean, how to have to show such kindness to so many people, such that it prompts a manager to call the person who just arranged the visit. I mean, like, I want to know, like, I want to get like the film footage of that. Like, what was he doing? But it's amazing. And of course, we've both had the pleasure of having known many people like this, and it's true. We don't often meet people like this in the modern world. But having spent so much time in these communities where there are a lot of people who are immersed in practicing the kind of stuff we're talking about today, it's amazing. You can just be in the presence of these people, and you just know something is different. Like they have rewired their brains and minds to operate in a fundamentally different way, and it definitely shows something about the possibility and potential that we all have in our own being. So
Yeah,
incredibly
and
inspiring.
one of the things I often say is this leads us to this very simple and yet really radical insight, and that is that flourishing is infectious.
Hmm. That's a great note to end on. Perfect. Nothing, nothing that can top that. So why don't we leave it there for today? In fact, that is maybe our call for all of us to bring this into our own lives, because it's not only beneficial to us, this ripples out, as you just said, Richie, and it infects in a positive way the people around us, and eventually the ripple effects probably go far beyond that. So such an inspiring vision to end on. So thank you, Richie, for another wonderful conversation, and thank you everybody for listening and for watching. We hope to see you again soon on another episode of Dharma Lab.